My daughter-in-law forgot her phone in my house. When it vibrated, the screen lit up with an image of my husband, who had passed away 4 years earlier. Some pains don't come from strangers. They arrive quietly, from the very people you believe are family. I stood there for a long time, unsure whether I should open the phone or set it down and pretend I had never seen anything. If it were you, what would you do? React immediately and demand an answer, or stay silent, even as your thoughts tangle into knots. I didn't do what most people would consider the right thing, and what happened afterward forced me to look back, not only at my family, but at the way I had lived my life all these years. If you're carrying a pain and don't know where to put it, stay. This story may help you slow down before deciding something for yourself. My name is Anna Miller. I am 69 years old. 4 years ago, my husband passed away after a sudden stroke. Since then, I've lived alone in a small house on the edge of the town of Hawthorne, where life moves more slowly, more quietly, and people pay less attention to one another's business. My life isn't anything special. I wake up early, usually before the sun has fully risen. The first thing I do is boil water and make a pot of hot tea. I drink it slowly, sitting near the window, looking out at the garden behind the house. At this age, I no longer rush. No one is pushing me to go anywhere or become someone. After tea, I step outside into the garden. Just a few vegetable beds and some flowers. Not enough to be called beautiful, but enough to tend. I like the feeling of my hands in the soil. It reminds me that I'm still alive. Still here. Still have something to do each day. Many people think a widow living alone must be lonely. That may be true for some. For me, it is a necessary stillness. Silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it helps you hear yourself more clearly. I'm not particularly religious and I'm not good at speaking in lofty terms, but I believe in something that nothing in life happens without a reason. Every event comes with its own cause, even if we don't understand it at first. That belief doesn't make me stronger than anyone else. It simply keeps me from panicking when things happen. I'm used to holding back a little, looking a little longer, and questioning myself before questioning others. I don't think of myself as weak. I've experienced enough loss to know that I don't break easily, but I'm not sharp or calculating either. I'm not someone who competes or tries to outmaneuver others. I live by listening and accepting that there are things beyond my control. That may be why people around me often see me as gentle, sometimes even slow. I don't argue with that. At this age, I no longer need to prove anything. I believe that if I can keep my mind calm, sooner or later, things will reveal themselves as they truly are. And if something is about to happen, I trust that I'll be quiet enough to see it when it finally arrives. Laura came to visit me on a weekday morning, as she occasionally does. Not regularly, but often enough that outsiders would think she's a considerate daughter-in-law. That day, she arrived earlier than usual and stayed less than half an hour before standing up to leave, saying she had something urgent to take care of. I didn't ask many questions. At this age, I understand that everyone has parts of their life they don't want to explain. I walked her to the door and reminded her to drive carefully. Laura smiled, nodded, and left in a hurry. About 10 minutes later, as I was clearing the tea table, I heard a soft vibration. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to catch my attention. The sound came from the small table beside the sofa, where Laura had been sitting earlier. Her phone was lying there. I picked it up with the simple intention of taking it out to the porch in case Laura came back for it. The screen lit up as soon as I touched it, and in that moment, my heart stopped. On the screen was the wallpaper, a face so familiar I didn't need to look closely to recognize it. David, my husband, the man who had died 4 years ago. I didn't gasp or drop the phone. It was just a strange sensation moving through my chest, as if someone had gently but firmly paused my breathing for a few seconds. I stood there, staring at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't a photo I'd ever seen in our family albums. David looked different. Different clothes, a different smile, as if the picture had been taken at a time I knew nothing about. I knew I shouldn't look any further. A phone is private. I've lived nearly 70 years and have always believed that boundaries deserve respect, even with family. But something felt off in that moment. Nothing obvious, nothing loud, just a vague sense that things weren't as simple as they appeared. I set the phone back down on the table, my heart uncertain. A thought crossed my mind, one that was old and familiar to me. Some things in life don't come to you by accident, and they don't leave on their own either. If something appears right in front of you, perhaps it's because the time has come for you to see it, sooner or later. I stood there for quite a while, the phone still resting on the table, its screen long since gone dark. I thought I wouldn't open it. I told myself that. But then I thought about David's eyes in that photo. They weren't the eyes of a man worn down by illness, as he had been in the final years of his life. They were the eyes of someone alive, happy, and somewhere else. I picked up the phone again. This time, my hand shook more noticeably. Not out of fear, but because my body was reacting to something my mind had not yet caught up with. The screen lit up. A message notification appeared. I only meant to glance at it, to see who was trying to reach Laura and then turn it off right away, but even a single short line was enough to empty my mind. The message was not vague. There was no room for misunderstanding. The words were intimate, familiar, as if the sender and the recipient had been speaking to each other this way for a very long time. Not once. Not as a momentary mistake. I sat down in the chair, the old wooden chair pushed up against the wall where I read the newspaper every morning. The phone felt heavier than usual in my hand. I kept reading, not out of curiosity, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining things. The messages went back for months, then years. The way they spoke to each other wasn't that of two people who had just met. It carried the familiarity of a relationship woven into everyday life, carefully arranged, repeated, and sustained. I realized I was breathing very slowly. My hand was trembling, but there was no surge of anger, the way people often describe. There was no thought like, they deserve to be punished. In my mind, there was only one sentence, clear and calm. This had gone too far a long time ago. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to avoid it, but to let the pain move through me. The pain was there, unmistakable, but it wasn't sharp. It felt like a weight pressing on my chest, forcing me to sit still and breathe more slowly. I asked myself the questions that anyone in my position would ask. What had I missed? Were there moments when David had tried to say something and I hadn't listened? Were there times when I had been so consumed by my own exhaustion that I failed to truly see the person beside me? I didn't blame myself to the point of torment. I've lived long enough to know that in a collapse like this, it's rare for one person to be entirely right or entirely wrong. But I didn't avoid my share of responsibility either. If there were moments when I had turned away, when I hadn't noticed the changes, that was something I needed to face honestly. What hurt me the most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the fact that it had existed for so long, right within the life of my family, without me ever knowing. Not because I was foolish, but because I trusted. I placed the phone face down on the table. I don't know when the tears began to fall. There was no sobbing, no sound, just quiet tears, enough to tell me that I was hurting and that I didn't need to deny it. I sat there for a long time in that silent room, not thinking about what I should do next, just staying there with the truth that had just revealed itself. And I knew that from that moment on, something in my life had changed, even though I didn't yet have a name for it. I didn't call Laura that day. I didn't call my son either. I didn't text, didn't ask questions, didn't make a scene about what had just happened. After setting the phone down, I stood up and went into the kitchen to reboil the kettle. Every movement was slow. Not because I was forcing myself to stay calm, but because my body naturally chose that pace, as if something inside me was reminding me that this was not the moment to say or do anything. I made tea, carried the cup to the table, and sat down in the familiar old chair. Steam rose softly in front of me. I wrapped both hands around the cup to feel its warmth. That was the only thing I focused on for the first few minutes. The pain didn't disappear. It was still there, genuine. But I didn't push it away, and I didn't cling to it either. I let it pass through me, the same way I had once let exhaustion pass after long nights caring for David when he was still alive. I had learned something over the years, first as a wife, then as a mother, and now as the one left behind. When your heart is unsettled, every word can easily become a wound. Every action can turn into something you later regret, not because you are cruel, but because you are hurting. I didn't try to analyze right and wrong at that moment. I didn't look for ways to rationalize what had happened. I sat still and acknowledged that I was shaken, and that any reaction coming from that state could push everything further than it needed to go. There are things in life that, if done too early, will be done wrong. And there are things that, if spoken when your heart is not yet steady, can never be taken back. I believe that, not because someone taught me, but because I have paid the price for hasty words in the past. So I chose to stop, not to stop to avoid, but to stop so I wouldn't make things worse. Everything has its time. When it isn't time yet, forcing it won't work. And when the time comes, no amount of avoidance will keep it from revealing itself. That afternoon passed very slowly. I sat for a while longer, then went out to the garden to water the plants, as I always did. The sun gradually sank behind the distant line of trees. Everything continued as it did every day, except I knew that beneath that quiet surface, another current had begun to flow, and I needed to stay clear-minded enough not to be swept into it too soon. I didn't do anything more for several days after that. I didn't try to confront anyone, and I didn't go through Laura's phone again. When she came back to retrieve it that afternoon, I handed it to her as if nothing had happened. Laura thanked me hurriedly, her eyes flicking past me for just a moment. I didn't ask her to stay. I thought I would stop there. But the truth has its own way of surfacing, even when we don't actively seek it out. A week later, my son Daniel stopped by one evening. He looked more tired than usual. Before he had even settled in, he began asking me a few scattered questions about old family expenses, about some paperwork related to his father's insurance from years ago. I didn't ask why. I answered what I remembered. Daniel said he had recently noticed some old financial discrepancies, nothing significant but recurring, small, regular transactions that stretched back to before David's death. At first he thought it was a bookkeeping error, but after checking again, it turned out not to be that simple. I listened, my chest growing heavier, not out of fear, but from that familiar feeling when scattered pieces begin to find their place. A few days later, Daniel mentioned that Laura had brought up someone named Mark. According to her, he was an old acquaintance who had helped David with some paperwork while he was still alive. I had never met Mark, and I had never heard David mention that name when he was well. What caught my attention wasn't the name itself, but the way Daniel spoke. He wasn't accusing. It was more a sense of unease. He said that Laura often used Mark as an intermediary for many matters, from finances to insurance, as if everything had to go through that person. Not long after that, a letter from a legal office was delivered to Daniel's home. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a notice that they were reviewing some old files related to David's death, as there were details that needed further clarification. I wasn't called in for questioning. No one asked me to do anything. I only knew that things had begun to move in a different direction, slowly but steadily. When Daniel told me all this, I wasn't as surprised as I thought I would be. Instead, a chill ran down my spine. Not because I was afraid of being implicated, but because I realized that this story may never have been just about a wrongful relationship. I didn't try to piece the facts together. I didn't have enough information, nor the ability to do that. I listened to what was placed in front of me, one piece at a time. Nothing more. There were moments when I wondered if I was taking things too seriously, but then I remembered the look in David's eyes in that photo. I remembered the subtle but unmistakable sense that something was off that morning. If it had only been an affair, it wouldn't have lasted so long or been concealed so carefully. And if there were others involved, people standing behind it all, pulling the strings, then I understood that this was no longer a story someone like me could resolve with emotion or speculation. I did nothing. I continued living as usual, tending the garden, drinking tea, welcoming Daniel and my grandchild when they came to visit. But inside, I knew the truth was moving toward the light in its own way. And this time, all I needed was the clarity not to turn away when it appeared. Daniel came to my house late one evening when the air had begun to turn cool. He didn't give much notice, just called to say he was stopping by. When I opened the door, I immediately saw the exhaustion on my son's face. Not the kind that comes from work, but the kind that comes from carrying too many thoughts inside. We sat across from each other in the kitchen. I made tea, as I always did. Daniel held his cup but didn't drink right away. He looked at me for a moment, then asked directly, his voice lowered, "Have you noticed Laura acting differently lately?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I was avoiding the question, but because I knew this was a fragile moment. One careless sentence could push my son farther than necessary. "Why do you ask?" I replied. Daniel exhaled, as if he had been waiting for that question for a long time. He said that Laura was often away from home on certain fixed days, that her explanations were becoming less convincing, that inside him was a feeling he couldn't quite name, part suspicion, part fear. I looked at my son, a grown man with a family of his own, who in that moment clearly resembled a confused child. I didn't want to be the one to add more weight to his pain. "I've noticed that some things don't seem right," I said slowly, "but I don't think I should be the one to draw conclusions for you." Daniel looked up, his eyes redder. "You know something, don't you?" I nodded. Very slightly, I told him what I had seen, what I was certain of, and what I wasn't. I didn't add or subtract anything. I didn't speculate. I told the truth as it had come to me. I didn't say that Laura was wrong or deserved condemnation. I didn't tell Daniel what he should do next. I only said one thing I truly believed. "The truth isn't meant to destroy a family," I said. "But if you refuse to look at it, the family will fall apart on its own in a more painful way." Daniel stayed silent for a long time. I didn't rush him. I knew there were decisions no one could make for another person, not even a mother. "I'm scared," Daniel said finally. "I'm afraid that if I face this, nothing will be the same." I placed my hand over his. "That may be true," I said, "but it may also mean you no longer have to live with suspicion every day. The truth doesn't force you to choose a path right away. It simply shows you where you're standing." That night, Daniel left very late. As I watched his car disappear down the lane, I knew my son was stepping into a brutal stretch of road. I couldn't walk it for him. All I could do was be there, calm and honest enough, so that when he needed it, he would know he wasn't facing everything alone. Things didn't unfold quickly, the way they often do in stories people tell. There was no loud confrontation, no dramatic confession, just a sequence of slow, steady steps, irreversible. Daniel called me early one morning. His voice was lower than usual. He said the authorities had reached out, requesting additional documents related to his father's old financial records. There were discrepancies, enough for them to broaden their review. No one was formally accused, no names were publicly called, but from that moment on, I knew this had crossed the boundary of a private family matter. Laura left the house a few days later. She said she needed time to think. Daniel didn't stop her. I didn't ask more questions. Some questions, asked at this point, only add to the exhaustion. Then the name Mark appeared officially in the records, not through hearsay but on paper. His role became clearer. little by little. Connections that once seemed scattered now stood side by side in a way that made it impossible to look away. I wasn't called in right away. I was only informed that if needed, they would contact me. I continued living as usual, but the quiet in the house had changed. It was no longer a gentle stillness, but a heavy silence, as if everything were holding its breath, waiting for something to be named. The day they officially concluded that wrongdoing had occurred, Daniel came to see me. He didn't say much. He just sat down, head bowed, hands clasped together. I didn't ask for details. I knew what needed to be said had already been said elsewhere, in the language of the law, not of emotion. Those responsible would be held accountable in their own way, not quickly, not loudly, but clearly. I didn't feel relief in the sense of joy. There was no feeling of victory, no thought that justice had taken my side. What I felt was a subtle internal shift, as if a heavy weight I had carried for years without realizing it had finally been set down. I realized that the most exhausting part of this entire time wasn't the pain, but the uncertainty. When the truth is hidden, people expend enormous energy doubting, questioning, and blaming themselves. When things are put back in their proper place, even if it hurts, they have a precise shape, and that makes it possible to breathe out. That evening, I sat alone in the kitchen, drinking tea as I did every day. There was no one to share the news with, nor was there a need. I sat there, feeling the silence around me. Not empty, not light, just quieter than before. I knew this wasn't the end. It was only a necessary pause, an order restored. And in that heavy silence, I understood that from here on, each person would have to continue down their own path, carrying what the truth had left behind. After everything came to light, my family didn't collapse in a loud, dramatic way. There were no major arguments, no tearful turning away. It dissolved slowly, like a block of ice left in the middle of a room, untouched, yet quietly disappearing. Daniel moved out for a while, not out of anger, but because he needed space to breathe. He told me the old house held too many memories and each one weighed more than he had expected. I didn't try to stop him. Some temporary distances are necessary to prevent further injury. My grandson didn't understand things the way adults do. He could only sense that something around him had changed. He asked me why his mother wasn't coming home anymore. Why was his father often silent? I didn't know how to give a complete answer. I only told him that sometimes adults need time to fix things that have gone off course. He nodded, as if he understood, though I knew he didn't fully. Children accept truth more through feeling than through reason. I didn't step in to explain things for anyone. I didn't try to be the strongest person in the family. I was there when Daniel needed a hot meal, when my grandson needed someone to pick him up after school, when both of them needed a place where no one would ask more questions. There were evenings when I watched my son sit quietly by the window, the yellow light casting itself across his tired face. I knew he was hurting. Not only because of the present loss, but because of the sense that an entire part of the life he had trusted was no longer intact. I didn't say that everything would be okay. I didn't promise anything I wasn't sure of. I told only one honest thing. Justice doesn't make pain disappear overnight. It simply frees people from having to doubt anymore. When the truth is clear, the wound is still there. But at least it is no longer being dug deeper by unanswered questions. My family is no longer what it once was, but it isn't over either. We are existing in a different form now, more fragile, slower, and requiring more patience. And I understand that sometimes that is all a person can do after everything has broken open. Life doesn't return to normal in the way people often say it does. It doesn't snap back like a switch. It simply slows down, settles, and then finds its own rhythm. I spend more time in the garden behind the house again, not to forget anything, but because it's where I can still put my hands in the soil and do something tangible. Each morning I water the plants, pull weeds, and cut away the dried branches. Some flower beds no longer bloom the way they used to. I don't try to save everything. If a plant survives, I keep it. If it can't make it through the cold season, I'll let it go. I'm learning to accept that without blaming myself. My grandson stays with me more often now. He does his homework at the kitchen table where his father used to sit reading the newspaper every evening. Sometimes he looks up and asks me a straightforward question, unrelated to everything the adults have been through. I answer, and I feel my heart lighten just a little. I don't bring up the past on my own, not to avoid it, but because I understand that talking more doesn't necessarily heal more. When Daniel wants to talk, I listen. When my grandson asks, I answer in ways he can understand. As for the rest, I let things settle on their own. There are nights when I still think of David, of the good things, and also the things I once didn't want to see. But I no longer try to piece everything together in search of more answers. What I needed to know, I now know. What cannot be changed, I no longer carry with me. I've come to realize that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It simply means not allowing what happened to direct every thought and action from now on. The pain is still there, but it no longer sits at the center of my life. In the afternoons, when the sunlight grows low, I often sit on the porch and watch my grandson play in the yard. Daniel sometimes stands nearby, silent. There's no need to say anything. It's enough to know that we are still here, still trying to live kindly with one another in this new reality. I don't know what the future will hold, but I know I don't need to rush to get there. I only need to take slow, steady steps. For me, that is enough. And for anyone listening to this story, if you are also carrying a pain that hasn't yet closed, allowing yourself to slow down may be the beginning of hope. One morning, as I sat alone in the kitchen, sunlight slanting through the window the way it used to long ago, I suddenly realized that everything had truly passed. Not because I no longer remembered, but because the memory no longer weighed on my chest the way it once did. I looked back on the road I had just traveled and understood one thing clearly. I hadn't won against anyone. I didn't defeat Laura, nor did I overcome Mark in the way people usually think of victory. The only thing I managed to do was keep my mind from being pulled too far off course during the most chaotic days. There were times when, if I had reacted faster, spoken more, or made a scene from the beginning, the outcome might have been different. But truth has its own rhythm. When the time isn't right, forcing it only creates more damage. And when the time comes, whether we want it to or not, it will step into the light on its own. Life's consequences don't need anyone to push them along. Every choice leaves a mark. We don't always see it right away, but it doesn't disappear. It simply waits for the right moment to appear. I don't view what happened as some profound lesson. It is an experience I had to pass through, as so many others do. The difference is that I chose to slow down a little, so I wouldn't lose myself while everything was falling apart. If you're listening to this story and in pain, I want to say one straightforward thing. Please don't rush. Don't rush to confront. Don't rush to decide. Don't rush to speak words you may have to carry with you for the rest of your life. First, keep yourself steady. Steady in your breathing. Constant in the small, everyday things. When your mind is clear enough, the path you need to take will appear, not with noise, but with clarity. I don't know what you will choose, but I believe that if you don't let pain lead you, then whatever the outcome, you will still be whole enough to keep living. And for me, that is enough.